So Tyler, maybe just say your name and who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Tyler Shultz, and I'm most well known for blowing the whistle at Theranos as my first job out of college. But after that, I went on to start 2 diagnostics companies myself. I've become a husband and a father, and now I actually speak full time about my experience at Theranos and hope that we can bring some lessons to all kinds of stakeholders.
Well, we're glad to have you speaking today to us. I first learned about you, Tyler, when you were the whistleblower at Theranos. How'd you become the Theranos whistleblower?
I guess the first step was working at Theranos. In a nutshell, I joined the company very, very excited. I thought that was the type of company that I could work at for my entire career. I thought it was just the absolute perfect place. It was the Apple of healthcare. But pretty much as soon as I joined, like we're talking about first day as a full-time employee, red flags started popping up. And they just kept popping up. We were deceiving regulators, we were deceiving investors, we were deceiving the board, we were deceiving doctors and patients. And so I started raising these concerns. And so I first talked to my colleagues, who also kind of became some of my friends at Theranos. I talked to my managers, and ultimately I talked to a vice president, the CEO, the COO and president, a board member, a regulator, and nothing ever happened when I went to all of those channels. And so it wasn't until a Wall Street Journal reporter reached out to me digging into some questions about Theranos, and I started talking to him, that things really started happening and moving. And that's when I really became a whistleblower. And the first time that I ever thought of myself as a whistleblower was reading it in the Wall Street Journal with the whistleblower word written right next to my name.
Oh, interesting. So you mentioned the red flags that you saw. What were some of the red flags that you saw at Theranos?
So, I mean, how much time do we have? But, probably the biggest red flag was that the technology that Elizabeth had been touting simply did not exist. This device that could test for hundreds of things from a single drop of blood without the infrastructure of a central laboratory did not exist. It was an 8-channel pipette on a robotic arm. There was no microfluidics in it. There was no new signal transduction method. It could only test for one thing at a time. It wasn't even a standalone platform. And so really the technology not existing was the root of all the problems. And then everything else kind of followed from that. You know, the deceiving of the regulators, the hiding inaccurate results, the lying to investors, that all stemmed from the fact that the technology didn't exist.
And when did you know that there's something off about this technology? When did you figure out that this was not quite what it was claimed to be?
So the big aha moment was really on my 4th day working there.
Wow.
And that is when I joined what was called the assay validation team, where our jobs were to make sure that these tests worked before we tested real patients. And as part of our onboarding into that lab, we got to see what they called the quote unquote open reader. So it was the Theranos device that did not have the plastic shell on it. So you could see exactly what was inside, exactly what it was doing. And the first time that I was seeing this was actually the first time that my manager was seeing this, which is kind of odd because my manager had been working there for a few years, but had never seen the product that she was working on. But we're watching this demonstration together, and I just remember my manager turning to the woman who was giving us the demo, and she just said, "Do you think this is cool?" And the woman just shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'll let you decide for yourself." And in that moment, I realized there was an open secret in the scientific community at Theranos that the technology just didn't exist. So that was the first real indication that something was wrong. But actually, maybe the first indication was even earlier than that. So I joined on the day that Theranos launched the product. But on my first day, I also learned that even though we had just launched the product, that we had no tests that were validated on the platform, which meant if a patient went into Walgreens, first of all, they would not get the finger prick that had been promised. They would have gotten a needle in the arm. And then on top of that, none of those tests were run on the Theranos equipment. We either diluted the blood and ran it on third-party equipment, or we would just literally just send it out to other labs to do the testing. So even though we had launched the product, we really just launched the perception of a product. We launched like a business model more than launching a product.
Wow, interesting. Well, what happened when you raised these questions? What happened after you told the CEO, Elizabeth Holmes, about this concern?
Yeah, so Elizabeth was not very receptive to my concerns. I first confronted her in her office with just a couple points, and she kind of brushed me off. And I followed up with a much longer email. And in this email, I pretty much wrote, like, this is an observation that I've made. This is data to support that observation. And this is what I think we should do about it. And I ended that email by saying, I apologize if this sounds attacking in any way. It is truly not meant to be. I'm dedicated to the long-term vision of this company, but I'm worried that some of our short-term practices will prevent us from reaching those long-term goals. And she did not respond to that email. She forwarded it to Sunny Balwani and for context, he was the president, COO, a board member, an investor, and also Elizabeth's boyfriend. And so he responded to the email, and his email was literally in all red, a lot of it capitalized, a lot of it bolded. And he essentially said that I was arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless. I had no understanding of basic math, science, or statistics. If I had any other last name, I would have already been held accountable in the strongest way. And the only conversation he wanted on this moving forward was an apology from me. And so,
Wow.
yes, they did not take my advice.
When he mentioned your last name, I know your grandfather, George Shultz, was an investor at Theranos. How did that impact your decision and your role with the company?
Yeah, so he joined as a board member. I don't know the exact timeline, but it was around the same time that I joined the company. And it played a huge role in my decision to become a whistleblower and the way that I went about it. And the way that his influence impacted my decision changed a lot throughout this story. So when I first became a whistleblower, obviously a huge motivation of mine was that I knew patients were getting hurt, right? That was the main motivation. But on top of that, I really cared about my grandfather's reputation. And he had a really, really great reputation. In fact, the first time I ever spoke to the Wall Street Journal reporter, I told him on the phone that my grandfather was part of the Nixon administration during Watergate. He was the Secretary of Treasury. He was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan during the Iran-Contra scandal. And he made it out of both of those with his integrity completely intact. So I thought, if he can make it out of Watergate with his integrity intact, there was no doubt in my mind that if he was given the opportunity, that he was going to make things right with the people that Elizabeth had hurt. And he would make it out of this with his integrity intact. So I wanted to make sure he had that opportunity. And I think he was 95 or 96 years old at the time. So I wanted to make sure that this story came out before he passed away so that he had that opportunity. So that was really part of my motivation for becoming a whistleblower.
But he doesn't seem to be as welcoming of that to you. Your book is really, I think, really powerful in how you show repeated conversations with your grandfather about this work. How did that relationship unfold over time through this process?
Yeah, unfortunately, he pretty much disappointed me at every possible opportunity, and our relationship just really degraded over time. He continued to take Elizabeth's side over mine. He continued to defend her over me, even after the Wall Street Journal had come out with all of their reporting, even after there were investigations by the FDA and CMS. He just continued to support her. He was just under some sort of spell, it seemed like. And so eventually it got to the point where I felt like I have to stop making decisions with his best interest in mind. I have to do what's best for me. He was 96 years old and I was just starting my career. I was just starting my professional adult life. And so I thought I need to, look after myself here. So at one point I really just started focusing on myself and stopped caring what the consequences would be for him. And I thought if he's sued in some lawsuit and loses all of his money, if he somehow ends up in prison, if he's held liable for this, I have to be okay with that because I've done everything I can possibly do to help him and to get him out of this. But he would not take any of those opportunities.
Well, in your book, you're really describing great detail about the conversations back and forth around this and the real disappointment. Did you ever reconcile with your grandfather?
To some extent, he never apologized to me for his role in this. He never really even acknowledged the role that he had in enabling Elizabeth to do what she did. But he did admit that I was right. But he did so long after it was really useful. These are after the SEC had found that there were instances where Elizabeth told prospective investors that their revenue the previous year was $108 million, when in reality it was only $100,000.
Wow.
And so when it's that black and white, coming from an investigation by the SEC, that's when he felt like, Elizabeth might be lying to me here. So it took until that point for him to come around. But the last conversation that I had with him in person before the COVID lockdowns, he invited me over to his house, and he actually told me about a time that he saw Elizabeth lie where I didn't have to force him to see this. And so I think that was kind of his way of really letting me know that he saw that she was lying and that I was right. And what he told me was that during Fleet Week in San Francisco, when they bring the battleships into the bay and they have the Blue Angels fly over the city, he got Elizabeth an invite to speak on a battleship to a group of Navy sailors. And he said with tears in her eyes, she got up there and told these young men and women who were potentially sacrificing their lives for the United States that she was just so honored and humbled that her life's work was saving the lives of United States servicemen and women. And he just said, I could not believe that any human being was capable of lying to those people as confidently and as convincingly as she lied. And so it meant a great deal to me for him to say that. But at the same time, he did fall a bit short in as far as making things right and taking accountability for his involvement.
You know, you spent years, Tyler, and lots of money, almost $500,000, you said, to defend yourself in the midst of this really intense, high-profile case. What was the scariest part of being a whistleblower?
So the scariest part to me was that I knew with 100% certainty that I was right. There was no doubt in my mind. And I thought, if I'm ever, if I ever actually go to court against Elizabeth, I'm just going to say, if this thing works in a medevac helicopter, it should work in a courtroom. Go prick the judge's finger, and if you can get 300 results from a single drop of blood, I will lie down, I will say I was wrong, I will say anything you want me to say, I will give up. But I just knew that there's no chance that they would be able to do that. There's no way they would be able to actually prove me wrong. The scary part was that I didn't think that mattered. It really seemed like the only thing that mattered in our legal system was how much money you could spend. The truth counted for nothing. The only thing that mattered was that you could buy the truth. And they had tremendous amounts of resources, way more than what I had. And it became clear that part of their strategy was just to get me and my family to spend all the money we had and then take us down. And I gave this analogy in my audiobook, but it felt like we settled these legal disputes over games of one-on-one basketball, but you get to choose who goes and plays for you. And if you're Theranos, you can go hire LeBron James to go play for you, and anyone else just does not stand a chance. And that's how it felt for a very, very long time. But luckily, what I learned is that the truth does count for a lot. It just takes a painfully long time.
It does, yeah. And a time when you were also followed by private investigators, when you were threatened with lawsuits, when you're getting pressure from your grandfather and others to do this. How did you find the courage to do the right thing in the face of all this pressure and in this very high stakes case?
I really felt like it could be the most important thing that I do in my life. I felt like it was hugely important for me to see this through. One thing that I think people don't understand about being a whistleblower is it's just not a decision you make one time and then you live with it. You have to remake that decision every single day because there are constantly opportunities to say you were wrong, to give up, to take an out. And I just felt like that I couldn't do that. I couldn't give up. I had to see this through. And I look back on some of the things that Sonny accused me of on my last day, arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless. And in a lot of ways, I recognize now that he wasn't really wrong. I might phrase it differently. I would say I was extremely confident. I had an extremely high risk tolerance, and I was totally naive of what the personal consequences would be to me. And in a way, that was a really interesting combination of factors. It's a really unique type of courage that comes with being young. And I'd like to think that today, now I'm 34 years old, that I would still do the same things that I did when I was 22, 23, 24. But at the same time, it was much easier for me to do when I was that age because I didn't have a wife, I didn't have kids, I didn't have a mortgage. In a lot of ways, I had a lot less to lose than I do now. And so that, in a way, may have helped me garner that courage. And then on top of all of that, I really think that my parents honestly just did a really, really good job raising me and raising me with values. So much so that I was, absolutely unrelenting. I would not allow my own personal values to be compromised no matter what. I think maybe my parents were disappointed in that a little bit. They would have preferred that I just give up and move on with my life, but I would not. I absolutely would not compromise on my values. I wouldn't sign affidavits under penalty of perjury that Theranos was trying to get me to sign because I knew they weren't true. And I was not willing to say that I was wrong when I knew that I was right. And so I don't know exactly, to be honest, but it was a combination of just all of those things.
So Tyler, I spent a lot of time thinking about, reading about, writing about the virtue of hope. And it's a hard virtue because you have to avoid kind of optimism that is so blind to reality, but also despair that can be very tempting to us. What was it like when you were in the midst of all the hardest things, when despair might have been a real temptation for you? How did you maintain your hope?
So in a lot of ways, I didn't. I think in some ways I resigned myself to the fact that I was going to lose, but I was going to fight to the end anyway. And I was so young, and I recognized that I was so young that I felt like it almost didn't matter. And what helped me come to that realization was actually my mom. She had a conversation with me, and she said, they're trying to take all of your money. They're trying to bankrupt you. They're trying to bankrupt us. But that doesn't matter because the most important things in your life, they cannot take away. They can't take away your family. They can't take away your education. They can't take away your friends. They can't take away the passion that you have for life. No matter how this ends, you are going to be okay. The most important things in your life, they cannot touch. And that was really empowering to me because I felt like, yeah, I can completely lose and that will be okay. I can change fields. I could move to a new country. Before I joined Theranos, I spent a couple months playing guitar on the streets of Ireland. And I was so happy doing that. I thought, I can move to Ireland and be a perfectly happy vagabond for the rest of my life if that's how this story ends. And so in a lot of ways, that was very freeing to honestly not even have the hope. Just know that the fight was worth it.
Yeah. And I love that it wasn't hope for an outcome, but hope for a way of being that you wanted to maintain. This person of real passion, of integrity with friends and family. You actually need to hope for that.
You can hope for that, and you can also control that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. A lot of agency involved in that sort of kind of hope. Yeah. You mentioned your parents. And so say more about your own childhood and how growing up shaped your character. Were there moments or people that really formed this sense of integrity and courage in the midst of difficulty?
Yeah. So going back to my parents, I mean, as an adult, I look back and I don't think I recognized it when I was a kid. I mean, how could you? But I did have amazing parents. And what I realized what they did was they created their life basically to dedicate themselves to raising their children, me and my two siblings. Everything in their life was around what was best for us, the jobs that they chose. Like my dad was a high school biology teacher, which meant he had summers off. He got out of school around the same time that we did, so he was coaching our soccer teams and basketball teams. My mom was a nurse and then became a full-time stay-home mom, once my brother was born. And I really just feel like we had so much attention from them, and they were very intentional about making sure that we had good values as we grew up. And at the time, could be like nauseating at times. But my dad would constantly tell us things like, you're the only person who has to live with you for the rest of your life. So you have to make sure you can live with yourself. You have to be able to sleep at night. You have to be able to look yourself in the mirror and be proud of the person that you are. And that message was just reiterated over and over and over. And then we even saw that reflected in the way that my parents behaved as well. One great example is that we used to go to church every Sunday, and then there was some incidents with pedophilia, and the church had an extra collection at the end of one of their services to pay for the legal fees of a priest who had been accused of pedophilia. And my parents just could not believe that the church was collecting money to defend this person. And so they literally stood up and walked out. And I was probably 10 years old at the time, you know? So to me, I didn't fully grasp the situation. I just thought, yes, I don't have to go to church anymore, you know? But really, it was a great example for their children, because they were saying there's ways to instill values in our family that don't require the institution of a church. And I think that was a powerful message to bring to their kids.
You are now a dad. You have two kids, 2 and 3 months old.
Yeah.
So how has your parents' example shaped your own sort of role as a father?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You don't know what parenthood is going to do to you until you become a parent. And what I very, very quickly realized is that a lot of my life up to that point had been, I would create a life that supported the job that I wanted to have. Like I was dedicated to my startups. I was a founder. And then that changed on a dime. Literally overnight, I had this realization that I need to create a life. I need to create a work life that supports my home life, not the other way around. And it really made me think about what my own values are. And the thing that I value most in my life is my family. And I realized when my son was born that I could not be the founder that I wanted to be and the father that I wanted to be at the same time, at least not at this moment in time. People do it, but at this moment in time, that was not possible. So I made the decision to step away from the startup that I was working on and just be a dad full time. Yeah. It kind of coincided with the time that Elizabeth and Sonny finally went to prison. And it also coincided with the time that my wife got her first job after being in dental school and residency until she was 31 years old or whatever. So it was just a great period of time to allow so my wife could go pursue her career. I took a step back from the crazy startup world, and I just started dedicating myself to being the best dad that I could be, and I've absolutely loved it. And the initial plan was to probably take 3 months and then try to go start another startup, join a venture fund, maybe start a fund. And here we are 2+ years later. Yeah. And yeah. I haven't done those things. But what I have done is I've created a business for myself where I go and speak. And it's been an amazing job for me because I'm able to come to places here like Wake Forest, and I feel like I can make an incredible impact on your students and on your community. But then I get to fly home, and then when I'm home, I'm dad 100%. And right now, it has just created the best work-life balance that I could possibly imagine. Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, I get that from my parents. I think my parents did that in a very different way, but kind of had that same idea.
Excellent. Well, you were amazing in our talk here at Wake Forest. I think you really sort of inspired students, faculty, and staff here about the importance of courage, commitment in the face of intense pressure. And I want to ask about your past in a different way. So to choose to blow the whistle at Theranos is a really big decision in a very high stakes, very public setting. Were there smaller decisions in your past where you really were tested in your character? And how did those shape your ability to do this now in this very high profile moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point. I think a great message that I try to give to students is that you can't just walk into Theranos right after graduating college and really expect to be able to to confront something like that without any practice. And there are all kinds of moments in our lives where there are challenges to our values. And the first step is to recognize when those values are being challenged. The next step is to act on it. And I like to say that it's like flexing a muscle. Like your ethical impulses are like muscles that you need to work out. You need to identify these situations. You need to flex those muscles. And that's how you grow as a person and how you grow that muscle. Then when the big one comes, when the Theranos event type comes, I think you're much more prepared. You understand yourself and what you're capable of. You have trust and confidence in yourself. You know who your support network is. And you know how to relieve stress in your own life. And you need the practice in order to figure out what those things are. And there are a few moments in my past that helped me kind of flex that muscle. I don't necessarily speak about them all publicly. Maybe someday I will, but know that they do exist. And a lot of that, again, comes from, I think, starting with my parents. Like when I was a kid, my parents would be able to identify those types of situations and talk about them with their children. And so that's something that I will hope to do as a parent, even though can be very hard to do.
Well, it's easy, especially in the academy, to focus on these big ethical moments, these big decisions, and reduce ethics to those really extraordinary cases. But I think what you're saying now is that these moments also happen in much more mundane ways, perhaps even daily in certain ways. So in your experience as a leader at Theranos or in your own companies, how have you seen ethical dilemmas arise daily, and how do you respond to those in your own role?
So I would say, especially as a founder of a startup, you are faced with ethical dilemmas daily. There is always pressure to exaggerate, to cut corners, and it can be really hard to resist that pressure. Sometimes it feels like everybody else is doing it. It's the only way. It's the formula for success. And one manifestation of this would be this idea of faking it till you make it in startups. And I think that concept has gotten really out of hand. And this is maybe a bit of a longer answer than you intended for, but that phrase, fake it till you make it, really became popular when Dropbox launched this very convincing demonstration of what Dropbox would be on YouTube. And they got tens of thousands of people to sign up for their wait list who thought, oh, this product looks amazing, I would love to buy it. And Dropbox took that wait list and they went to venture capital firms and said, look at all the people who want to buy our product. All we need is money to build it. They got the VC investment, they built the product, they sold it to everybody on the wait list. The rest is history. I see what they did as really good market diligence. They really made sure that they had a product market fit before they raised money, before they built the product, because they were a startup with constrained resources. But what they didn't do was they didn't sell a product that didn't work. They didn't pretend it worked when it didn't. They didn't take anybody's money under false pretenses. And that concept, I think, has been completely manipulated into pretend it works when it doesn't, which is exactly what Theranos did. They pretended it worked when it did not. Another great example would be Nikola, which they were developing hydrogen-powered cars, and they had this very convincing video that looked like the car was driving under its own power, but in reality, it was rolling downhill, and then they just tilted the frame so that it looked like it was driving, and they raised billions of dollars in a SPAC, in part due to marketing ploys like this video. And really, the technology just didn't work. And to me, that is not the same type of fake it till you make it that Dropbox deployed. But those are the types of situations that founders feel like they're always faced with. Another, I think, an example that every founder is faced with is just creating your revenue projection slide. And everyone feels like they need to exaggerate these revenue projections. And you'll get a lot of bad advice from advisors who will say, you need to show $500 million of revenue in less than 5 years. And it just becomes this, I think, a terrible way to start a relationship between a founder and a venture capital firm where everybody knows that this slide is made up. And the VC firms will even tell founders, like, we're going to half or more than half this number in our mind, so you need to double it or more than double it. Your job as a CEO is to be optimistic. And I would always push back on that type of rhetoric and that type of advice and say, my job as a CEO is not to be optimistic. Anybody can be optimistic. My job is to see around corners, predict problems, and try to solve those problems before they become potential issues that could destroy my company. That's what a good CEO should be doing. But unfortunately, I think you start with founders who start exaggerating about revenue projections, and then they're not clear where that line is. And then they take it too far.
Well, Elizabeth Holmes took it too far. She faked it and made it for a while, but then ultimately didn't make it. So she's now serving 11 years in prison for the fraud that she was convicted of. And so tell us more about Elizabeth. How did you come to meet Elizabeth, and what was your first impression of her?
So I met Elizabeth in my grandfather's living room. So I was a junior at Stanford at the time, and my grandfather was part of a think tank that was on campus. So he lived and worked on campus when I was there. And one day I got a phone call from him, and he just said, I'm having this brilliant woman come over to my house. I think you would learn a lot if you came over and listened in on the discussion. So I biked over to his house, and that's where I met Elizabeth. And she was wearing her all black outfit, the black turtleneck, very intentionally modeled after Steve Jobs. I heard her very deep, monotone, hypnotic voice, saw the unblinking, piercing blue eyes, and that's where I heard her lay out her vision for Theranos for the first time. A little interesting detail is that Dianne Feinstein was also there, senator from California. And what's interesting about that is after this meeting, obviously my grandfather and I were very captured by this vision and by Elizabeth's story. As far as I know, Dianne Feinstein had nothing to do with her ever again. So I would love to know, what did Dianne Feinstein see in that first meeting that my grandfather and I did not?
What made her so convincing? I mean, she was able to convince secretaries of state, military leaders, famous business leaders to join and invest in Theranos. How did she do it?
It's really hard to describe now just how charismatic she was, just how good she was at doing this. She just had so much credibility. Her words carried so much weight. When she walked into a room and started speaking, everyone would stop talking to listen to what Elizabeth had to say. Employees just wanted to please her. They wanted to be near her. She had this, people talk about how Steve Jobs had this reality distortion field. Elizabeth absolutely had that. She was just so good at being able to tell you exactly what you needed to hear for you to do what Elizabeth wanted you to do. And it's impossible to describe just how good she was. Like I say that founders need to be really good at telling stories. But Elizabeth took it a step further. She didn't just tell the stories, she wrote the stories. She would recreate her own life to support her narrative. The black turtlenecks, is the most glaring example. But there are others, like when Elizabeth first launched the product, they had this reporter come do a big story on Elizabeth and Theranos, and they interviewed her parents and her brother. And as part of this, Elizabeth showed the reporter her apartment in Palo Alto. And what she showed the reporter was like a 2-bedroom apartment with just a mattress and Evian water bottles in the fridge and a closet full of black turtlenecks. And the reporter wrote this story about how she lived an incredibly austere life. She had this monk-like devotion to Theranos. And that apartment was completely staged. In reality, she was living in a mansion in Atherton with her boyfriend, who was also the investor and COO of the company, right? Wow. So she would create these worlds that people just wanted to be true. She knew the story that people wanted to believe, and she just served it up on a platter for us to consume.
Wow.
And she's a master at it. And she's doing it again with her whole rebrand. She's not Elizabeth anymore. She's Liz with her 2 kids, and she poses with those kids in magazine and newspaper shoots, and she's on the cover of People magazine, even from prison somehow. She's trying to relaunch Theranos 2.0, basically, called Hamanthus, through her husband. And unfortunately, I think she's so good at this that she probably will have a second act, and she probably will do it somewhat successfully.
What motivates her?
I believe that at least when she started Theranos, she was not motivated by a true desire to help patients. I think she's obviously proven that she didn't care about patients' health. But I also don't think that she started Theranos wanting to commit a billion-dollar fraud. I think that she just really, really wanted to be famous. She wanted to be the youngest self-made female billionaire. She wanted to be the female Steve Jobs. She wanted to fly on private jets with Mark Zuckerberg. She wanted to be part of the President's Advisory Council. She wanted to be on the cover of Forbes and Fortune and Inc. magazines. And she achieved all of those things and then just didn't necessarily have an exit strategy. But I think that her primary driver was to be famous. And one really frustrating thing about that is, again, even from prison, she was on the cover of People magazine just a few months ago. And so even from prison, we're continuing to give her exactly what she wants.
Interesting. What about our culture now makes fame so seductive? We see people trying to be influencers and getting as many followers as possible to build their brands. How should we think about fame in our current culture?
Yeah, I think it can be a really dangerous thing because I think there's maybe not a lot of people exactly like Elizabeth, but a lot of people who have that drive to be famous, not necessarily to create something positive in the world. They just want attention. And the really unfortunate thing is that the easiest way to get attention is by just saying really divisive things on social media. And so I think people are able to get a lot of followers and fame just by being these loud voices on the internet. And I think it's a terrible, terrible thing for our society, honestly.
Yeah. Well, we think a lot about leadership on this podcast. And so I want to ask you about leadership and character. I know you've learned a lot about leadership in these last few years from your experiences, from your own experience as a leader, about what to do and also what not to do. And so what are some lessons that you've taken away from your experiences?
So I think a big one is just around culture building in your organizations. And I think in an odd way, Elizabeth and Sunny did an amazing job of building a culture at Theranos, albeit a very misguided one. But they knew the type of culture they wanted to build, and they were incredibly intentional about building that culture for a very long time. They wanted people to be afraid of them. They wanted no one to be willing to stand up to them. And so over a period of 10 years, they took every single opportunity to reinforce that culture. We had overbearing NDAs. We were not allowed to say that we even worked at the company on LinkedIn. We were told not to talk to colleagues about work. There were barricades, there were locked doors. And whenever anyone spoke up, they would be fired. And then after they were fired, sometimes they would be sued. And when they sued employees, they would even send out company-wide emails about it, where if you read between the lines, what they're saying is, we will sue you too if you get in our way. We will destroy your life. And so people would stop speaking up. Who's going to speak up? Nothing good comes of it. They see the feedback loops. They see it's not good for the person who speaks up. It doesn't benefit their colleagues. It doesn't benefit the patients. It's not good for anybody. So no one speaks up. And instead, the people who would want to speak up instead just quietly leave. And some people were even afraid to leave. I had a close colleague who was afraid to give notice. So he bought a house in a different state, came in on a Friday, did a full day's work, left his badge on his desk, walked out the door, and by Monday morning, he was in another state living in his new house, didn't give a single day's notice. He was just gone.
Wow.
And so when people do that, the type of people who are left are the people who will just go along with whatever they're asked to do. And there are all kinds of justifications. And I genuinely don't think I worked with bad people. I think my colleagues at Theranos were, they were funny, they were kind, they were ethical people. There were people I would consider my friends, but every day they were just put in situations where they had to compromise their values, and they got in the habit of doing that. And in a lot of ways, it felt like the Milgram experiment. And I even gave that exact analogy to my grandfather once. I said, it feels like I'm part of the Milgram experiment. I'm pushing this button and I hear somebody scream, and there's an authority figure that's just telling me to keep pushing the button, and I can't do it anymore. And when you look at that experiment, I don't think you would say the people who were pushing that button were actually bad, immoral people, right? They were just put in a bad situation and maybe they didn't know better. But to break out of that Milgram type of experiment is actually very, very hard to do. And that's the culture that Elizabeth and Sunny built very intentionally over a very long period of time. So what I hope companies and leaders do is to be thoughtful about the types of cultures they want to build, and be very intentional about that culture, and know that it will take a long time and a lot of reinforcement, just like it is with a parent and a child.
Well, you've parented both children and companies, and so how have you done that in your own work? How have you built a positive culture?
Yeah, I think the best way, it really comes down to transparency and humility. I think are two big ones. Transparency to me means people within your organization understand why you're making the decisions that you're making, and that helps keep everybody aligned. I also always wanted anyone to be able to feel like they could disagree with me. That is what I really think of as transparency, is people feel free to actually speak their mind. And it's really hard to build a culture to do that. And of course, it's easy to say, like, yes, of course, we want a culture where people can have passionate debates and all of that, but it's actually really hard to build that culture. And it's important to create positive feedback loops around that. And one thing that I found to be very useful is, even when you're having an argument, And especially in the scientific field, like passionate scientists will argue all the time. And it's a very healthy thing to do. And at the end of those arguments, you have to be able to take a step back and say, we're on the same team. I really like you as a person. You know, we're arguing and we're fighting maybe, and so maybe it doesn't feel good in this moment, but we're still friends, we're still colleagues, we're on the same team, and it's actually a really healthy thing that we're debating this, and we can actually come up with a solution. Luckily, in the field I've been working in, you can usually design an experiment and figure out whether A is happening or B is happening. And it turns out most of the time you'll both be wrong, and everyone will learn something new, and then you can continue to move forward. So being able to build that type of transparency, I think, is just so crucial. And it's, in the way, it's easier to do at a small startup because as a founder, you have a hugely outsized influence over that culture. But as the company scales, and honestly, I don't have a lot of experience doing this myself, but as the company scales, it becomes much harder when it's no longer necessarily just the founder setting the culture. It's all of the people that they've hired and all the people that they manage. But I still think as long as possible, you should have a culture where any employee at the company should feel confident or comfortable walking into the office of the CEO and saying, I have something you really need to hear. Of course, you need like chain of command and all that. You can't have every single employee walking to your office every single day. But in those specific moments, if there's an employee who thinks the CEO needs to know this, they should feel like they should be able to walk into that person's office and tell them.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about a great moment where it happened to you, where a student you're working with looked at one of your ideas and said, I don't think that'll work, actually.
Yeah.
And so I love that you were kind of modeling that even in your own book.
Oh, yeah. And that kind of comes down to the humility part, is you always need to be willing to admit that you're wrong about something, which I think is very hard for a lot of leaders to do. And you actually see this over and over again in the Theranos story, where either Theranos or like Walgreens, for instance, hired a laboratory expert to go due diligence on Theranos. The expert was not shown anything that they needed to see, so they went back to Walgreens and said, you should definitely not do a deal with this company. And they ignored that person. They didn't have the humility to say, well, we've gone through a hiring process and we've hired this consultant to go due diligence. Now we should listen to that person. Instead, they thought, we're a multi-billion-dollar company. We know better than this guy. We know what's better for our business than some laboratory consultant, right?
Wow.
And I really think that, again, just comes down to humility. You have to be able to recognize that you're not the expert in everything. And the best you can do is to hire the experts that you need and then listen to them and admit that you're wrong and be willing to change your mind.
You mentioned hiring. So when you think about hiring people for your companies, what do you look for? Are there certain skills or virtues or traits that you want to find in your new employees?
Yeah, so the thing that I really like to look for is, in a way, someone who reflects a lot of the values that I have. And it's good to find someone with complementary skill sets, but with maybe similar values. So find people who their skills they complement you, they can do things that you can't do, but you have those same values. And so how you tease those out can be a little bit challenging. But for me, one of my personal values is curiosity. Like, I'm a very curious person and I love pursuing curiosities. Like when I was an undergrad at Stanford, I was a mechanical engineer until I was a senior, and then I switched my major to biology. And I took all kinds of classes in computer science, and I took biochemistry classes, and I actually had a minor in math for a brief second, and then I had to switch one of my math classes to count towards my biology degree. But basically, I would be interested in something, and I would just go try to learn it. I would just go head first. And I've done that all throughout my professional career as well. And it's a great way to learn new skills. And I really like working with people who have that same type of mentality. So if I'm interviewing somebody, one thing that I like to learn about is a time that they've gone and learned something that was completely outside their skill set, or they got really, really into something that is maybe completely unrelated to what you're working on. A great example is I actually worked for a brief period of time at Roche, very big biotech company, and we were hiring for our team. And there was a man who came in who didn't have very much biochemistry experience at all, but you could tell that he wanted to learn so badly. And he was previously like a lifeguard, and he talked about the methodology that went into the way that he put chlorine in the pool and perfectly balanced the pH. And he just got so into it and so scientific about it that you could tell, like, this guy would be a great chemist. And so if you're willing to mentor someone like that, they can become a great employee.
So I want to ask about transparency, Tyler. You mentioned that as a kind of key value of yours, which you've learned pretty fundamentally in your time at Theranos. And I know in the startup world, there's often this view that you can't to be too transparent, for you might share your secrets, and others might get your ideas and take them or use them. And so how do you balance questions about when and how to be transparent in the midst of that threat out there? And I know Theranos went to the extreme on hiding their own secrets. How do you make the right decisions around transparency?
Yeah, it's really, really tough. And again, that's a true like ethical dilemma when one of your values is transparency, but then you're faced with a situation where that could actually hurt you. And that can happen a lot at companies and in startups. And it's good to think about those situations ahead of time before they happen, so you know actually how you will behave. And I actually think back to one of the excuses Elizabeth gave about being so secretive was that she said there were Chinese spies in Silicon Valley trying to steal the technology. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when I thought that was, completely made up. It was just a justification. And then actually a Chinese company did steal the technology of my first company, Flux Biosciences.
Wow.
And it was a little bit bittersweet because they published some papers out of China that was a complete replication of our technology, and the data looked amazing, right? So in a way, it was validation that what we were doing was legit. But at the same time, it became an impossible narrative to tell investors when they would ask, what are you going to do about this company in China that has exactly replicated the thing you were building, right? So there's truth to that. You can't be too transparent because people will steal your technology. And in somewhere like China, it can be really hard to enforce that, especially as a small startup. Maybe Apple can enforce it, but someone with a seed round is not going to be able to enforce that. And so when the investors ask what you're going to do you want to say, I'm going to spend your money on lawsuits to prevent this company from stealing our technology? Or are you going to say, we're going to let it go? Neither answer is very good. So you do actually, I've learned that you do have to be a little bit careful about the technology that you're building. But where I think it really crossed a line at Theranos was where it prevented colleagues from collaborating. Like the person in the first lab that I joined, we just developed antibodies for the tests. And not a single person I worked with ever saw the product we were working on. So the people who developed the antibodies would pass these antibodies off, and they would never speak to the people who then developed the tests using those antibodies. And then they would pass it off, and they would never speak to the person who validated that test. And then they would pass it off, and they would never speak to the person who ramped up that test for production to test real patients. Then they would pass it off, and they would never talk to the laboratory technician that actually tested the real patients. And when you have intentional blocks to communication at every single one of those steps, it's going to fail. There's no way that this is going to work if you don't allow these scientists to collaborate and debug things. It's an impossible way to do science, and I think it's an impossible way to conduct business in non-scientific areas as well.
Well, you're a person of tremendous integrity and wisdom. How do you stay true to who you are? How do you maintain your character in the midst of your daily life?
I think a big part of it is just by surrounding myself with people who know who I am and who value who I am. So I don't often feel pressures to change the person that I am. And that really helps me stay true to myself. And a lot of credit I have to give to my wife for that. We have very complementary values. She's very supportive of the type of work that I do. She's very supportive of me wanting to be home with my family as much as I possibly can be. And that extends to your friends as well, just surrounding yourself with like-minded people who necessarily don't do the same, just like when you're hiring people who may not necessarily do the same types of things that you do, but value the same things that you do.
Were your friends surprised to know that you were the Theranos whistleblower?
So I would say that they were shocked, but not surprised. There was certainly shock value in opening that newspaper and seeing that I was a Theranos whistleblower because I told nobody. I was so secretive. I didn't tell my housemates. I didn't even tell my girlfriend at the time that this was going on. I didn't tell her until right before the Wall Street Journal published that I was a whistleblower. So my friends were shocked to read that, but at the same time, I don't think they were surprised because they knew the type of person that I was. They knew that I had behaved similarly in other situations in the past, and they all just celebrated me. They were all so happy for me. They were so proud of me. I remember that first day after I went on the record, I came home to the house that I was renting with like 6 friends, and they'd just thrown a big party for me, and we popped champagne. And at the same time, I was getting this outpouring of support from the general community, LinkedIn messages, text messages, emails. I was just completely supported when I came out as a whistleblower.
I think that support is so valuable to this work.
Yes, and I certainly don't take it for granted. I know that most whistleblowers, their stories do not end as happy as mine has. So I'm very grateful that things really have worked out for me.
And it seemed like it was very lonely when it was happening. I mean, you were really talking about you couldn't tell anybody about this happening. Only your lawyers, not even your parents for a while, you couldn't tell. So how do you think about the time of sort of that real sort of constraint with this moments now of really being able to live a life where you can be open with your friends and family?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just holding this in as a secret for so long was one of the hardest things that I ever did in my life. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why I'm speaking so much about it now is that years later, I still have all this pent up, almost like emotion and stories. And it feels so good to be able to talk about it. But to really illustrate how closed off I was, I blocked every single number in my phone because I was afraid that someone would text me, "Oh, I remember you telling me XYZ about Theranos when you worked there." And this is when Theranos was threatening to sue me. And I thought something like that could maybe cause huge problems for me. So I blocked every single number in my phone book. I only communicated over Snapchat. I pretty much fell off the face of the earth to most of my friends. Nobody knew where I was, what I was doing, because I was so stressed that a simple question like, "Hey, how are you doing? What did you do today?" I didn't know how to answer that question because the answer was I was up in San Francisco with my lawyers, trying to negotiate my way out of this crisis all day, every day for like 4 months. And I couldn't tell anyone that. And so I'd have to lie. I would have to say, "Oh, I was, in lab on campus," and I just hated having to do that. So I just really cut myself off from the world. But to find some companionship, I did end up dating a woman that I met on Tinder. And she was a bioengineering PhD student actually at Stanford. And so when the Wall Street Journal started publishing about this was big news in the bioengineering world at Stanford. Yeah. So she and all of her friends were constantly talking about me in front of me without having any idea that they were talking about me.
Wow.
So I really felt like a fly on the wall of my own life. And the only way I could get relief from that was to finally go on the record. Like the only way for me to safely tell my friends and my girlfriend about what was going on was to tell the whole world.
And you did, and
I did
very bravely. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks.
So Tyler, you tell the story a lot. You speak now publicly about your experience at Theranos. What is it like, though, to talk about a story that was so difficult and so traumatic for you personally, and do it over and over again? How does that feel for you?
Yeah, so I'm actually really glad that I've been able to take this period of time in my life to dedicate myself to do this, because I had obviously been speaking for a while now, but it wasn't my focus. My focus was on my startups, and this was something I would occasionally do on the side. And I really like that I've now that Elizabeth and Sunny are in prison, that I can be a little bit more reflective on these experiences, that I've set aside time just to dedicate to doing this. And I've found it to be very rewarding because it was by far the most negative experience of my life. But when I do things like this, it helps turn it into a positive experience. And I find that to be incredibly rewarding, just personally. And what it's like to retell the stories over and over, it's actually different every time. Sometimes it feels like I'm reading it out of a book, and sometimes I feel like I'm back in that moment. And when I get up and start talking, I never know which one it's going to be. And sometimes it's harder to tell the story than other times. And when I start having that feeling, I change the types of stories that I might tell. So I found that every event ends up being a little bit different.
Well, there's so much we could talk about, Tyler, but I think your experience is so rich with so much insight and wisdom. And so, given your experiences at Theranos and beyond, what advice would you have for young people who maybe in your same shoes when you were looking for internships or looking for new jobs in your 20s about starting their careers, and what should they be looking for in a job and looking out for in a new job?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would just say pursue your curiosities. And sometimes that can be hard to do. You feel like you've made a decision and you're stuck with it. Like maybe you've committed to being a pre-med major or something like that, and you realize, I don't want to be a doctor for the rest of my life. Now is the time to make that change. Just like when Sonny called me arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless, like I think students, young people are in this amazing part of their life right now where they can take the opportunity to speak truth to power, to start a company, to change their majors, to change their field. So my number one piece of advice would be to take this opportunity, pursue your curiosities, find what you love doing, because I really believe that competency follows curiosity. So that's my number one piece of advice. And then as far as finding a place to work and interviewing, something that I would really recommend doing, which might take a little bit of courage to do, but when you have the opportunity to ask your interviewer a question, you should ask them, what are the core values of this company? And if they don't know, I think that's a really big red flag. There should be like 3 or 4 core values that every single employee at a company should know. And they should tell you what's important to that company. And it should be a framework on how to make decisions. And if they don't have that, I think that's a big red flag. I personally am also very, very wary of stealth mode startups in general. Like maybe it's just my personality. I need to be able to talk about what I'm doing. If I have to feel like I'm working at the CIA, I don't want to work there. If I can't tell my wife about what I'm doing, I don't want to work there. And I think it comes back to this kind of issue with transparency. Stealth mode startups say that they don't want someone to steal their technology, but I think that there are other ways to defend it. And sometimes they take the stealth mode a little bit too far, and it can really be a way of hiding other things.
Well, in the spirit of your advice, what are your 3 core values?
Family, curiosity, and authenticity. And I try it as best I can to make decisions in my life through the lens of those 3 core values. The main one is family, especially right now. Is what I'm doing the best thing that I can do for my family?
Yeah, that's great. Well, you're really an embodiment, Tyler, of courage, of authenticity, of character under immense pressure. And so we're just very grateful to have a chance to talk to you today about your story and to think about what we can learn from your lessons of character and leadership. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.